Keanu Reeves never imagined that fame would bring so much noise. When he was young and just starting in Hollywood, everything around him seemed fast, loud, and bright. There were lights flashing from cameras, voices calling his name, and invitations pouring in for events almost every night. For many young actors, this was a dream. They wanted to be seen at the biggest parties, standing next to the most powerful people, laughing in the middle of a crowd, and letting the world know they had arrived. But Keanu was different. From the very beginning, he felt like an outsider in this world of constant sound. When he attended his first big Hollywood party, it looked exactly like the magazines had described. Expensive clothes, tables filled with food, music so loud that people had to shout just to be heard, and laughter echoing through every corner. Stars moved from group to group, smiling for cameras, talking about deals, and building connections. But in the middle of all that, Keanu stood quietly, almost invisible. He looked around and felt something unusual. While others seemed happy, he felt empty. The conversations felt shallow, and the smiles seemed painted on. People laughed at jokes they didn't find funny, and others pretended to listen while their eyes searched the room for someone more important. Keanu realized that although this was supposed to be fun, it wasn't what he wanted. He walked out of that party earlier than expected. Instead of staying until morning like many others, he stepped into the night alone. The silence outside felt like a relief. The cool air, the sound of his footsteps on the street, and the distant hum of the city gave him more comfort than the loud music he had just left behind. In that moment, he discovered something important. Silence felt more honest than a room full of forced laughter. As his career grew, the invitations grew too. He was expected at every premiere, every award after party, and every social event where being seen mattered. Managers and agents told him it was important for networking, that showing up could lead to new roles and new opportunities. But Keanu always felt that if he wasn't being true to himself, then the opportunity wasn't worth it. Sometimes he still went, but whenever he did, he felt like he was wearing a mask. He would smile politely, nod during conversations, and stand among people who seemed full of energy. But inside, he was counting the minutes until he could return home, close the door, and sit quietly with a book or his guitar. Keanu began to notice how silence shaped his thoughts. In a quiet room, he could think clearly. He could feel his emotions instead of hiding them under noise. He could remember moments with his family, recall his early struggles, and understand what truly mattered. This was impossible in a room filled with people competing for attention. While others recharged through parties, he recharged through solitude. A motorcycle ride at night gave him more happiness than any champagne-filled celebration. Watching the sunrise alone gave him more meaning than staying out all night in a crowded mansion. His friends noticed his habits. Some admired his calmness and respected his choices, but others misunderstood. They thought he was distant or antisocial. They wondered why someone who was loved by millions would choose to be alone. Some even worried about his career. In Hollywood, parties were not just fun, they were business. Deals were made over drinks, roles were offered during conversations, and friendships with directors began on dance floors. By walking away from those parties, Keanu was also walking away from some chances. But for him, the cost of losing peace was far greater than the cost of losing a role. Even as he grew more famous, Keanu refused to let noise define him. At interviews, he often gave short answers, choosing words carefully instead of filling the air with meaningless talk. Reporters found him mysterious. Fans noticed his stillness. Other actors sometimes joked about how quiet he could be, but they also respected the discipline it took to stay calm when everyone else was rushing to be noticed. For Keanu, silence was not emptiness. Silence was full of meaning. It was a space where truth could be heard. One night, during the height of his early fame, Keanu was invited to a grand celebration hosted by a powerful studio head. Everyone in Hollywood was there: actors, producers, directors, and people who controlled the biggest films. His agent told him this was the kind of event that could change his career forever. If he impressed the right people, his future would be brighter. Keanu dressed up, went to the party, and tried to give it a chance. But again, after a few hours, he found himself leaning against a wall, listening to voices that blended into noise. Deals were being whispered, laughter filled the air, but none of it touched him. He felt more alone in that crowded room than he ever did in solitude. That night, he left quietly, while others stayed until morning. Outside, he took a deep breath, got on his motorcycle, and rode through the quiet streets. The feeling of the cool wind against his face reminded him that he was alive, free, and true to himself. At that moment, he decided he would no longer force himself to be part of something that drained him. Keanu knew this decision would have consequences. He would not always be seen at the right places. He would not always be chosen because he didn't mingle enough. But he also knew something more important: protecting his peace was worth more than impressing strangers. Silence was not just his preference, it was his strength. It kept him humble when fame could have made him proud. It kept him calm when stress could have broken him. And it kept him real in an industry that often pushed people to pretend. That was the beginning of his journey, choosing silence over parties, choosing peace over popularity. It was not the easy road, but it was his road. From then on, every time he walked away from noise, he walked closer to himself. And even though the world might not have understood at first, Keanu knew he had made the right choice. As the years went by, Keanu's choice became clearer to everyone around him. While the rest of Hollywood celebrated every new film with bright lights and loud music, he was often found somewhere far away from the noise. Sometimes he would leave the city completely and disappear for a few days. Other times he would sit alone in a quiet cafe, dressed so simply that people barely noticed him. Silence was not just something he liked, it became the way he lived. There were times when his friends tried to convince him otherwise. They would say, "Come on, Keanu, it's just one party. It won't hurt." Some of them even reminded him how much networking mattered. But he always gave a soft smile and said, "I think I'll pass." At first, people thought he was joking, but slowly they realized he meant it. He was different from the rest. While others needed crowds to feel alive, he needed stillness to feel real. One of his favorite ways to find that stillness was riding his motorcycle at night. When the city finally grew quiet and the streets were almost empty, Keanu would put on his helmet, start the engine, and let the road lead him. The sound of the motor was the only noise, and the cool air brushed against him like a friend. In those quiet rides, he could think clearly. He reflected on his life, his family, the people he lost, and the journey he was still on. To him, those rides were not just about freedom, they were moments of truth, far more meaningful than any conversation in a crowded party. But silence wasn't always easy. Choosing it came with its own challenges. While some people admired him for being true to himself, others misunderstood his behavior. There were whispers that he was too quiet, too mysterious, or even too cold. Hollywood loved people who were loud, charming, and always visible. And here was Keanu, calm, soft-spoken, and often invisible in the places where most actors wanted to shine. Some producers worried that his silence made him harder to approach. Some directors wondered if he lacked the energy for big roles. Even though his talent spoke louder than words, his refusal to live by Hollywood's rules sometimes made people hesitate. Keanu felt this weight but never let it change him. He understood that everything in life came with a price. If he chose silence, he might lose opportunities. If he chose parties, he might lose himself. For him, the choice was simple. His peace meant more than popularity. He knew roles would come and go, but if he lost his inner calm, it would be much harder to get it back. In the middle of all this, Keanu learned something about silence that many people never notice. Silence doesn't mean loneliness. Silence doesn't mean emptiness. Silence can be full of meaning, full of life. When he sat alone, he wasn't really alone, he was with his thoughts, his memories, his dreams. He could hear his own heart in ways that noise never allowed. He could reflect on what mattered and what didn't. Silence became his teacher, showing him truths that noise tried to hide. There was one moment that showed him just how much silence had shaped him. It was during a press tour for one of his films. The cast was invited to a large event after the premiere. Cameras flashed, reporters asked endless questions, and the party was filled with the biggest names in the industry. Many actors enjoyed it. They laughed, posed for photos, and seemed comfortable in the spotlight. Keanu was there too, but after a short while, he quietly slipped out. Instead of going to the after party, he walked down the street until he found a small bookstore still open. He stepped inside, greeted the owner politely, and began browsing through the shelves. For the next 2 hours, while the world expected him to be drinking and laughing with celebrities, he sat in a corner, flipping through pages of books. That night, he left the store with a small bag of novels and a peaceful smile. For him, that moment was worth far more than being photographed at a party. People who noticed his absence sometimes asked, "Why don't you like going out?" He never gave a long answer. He simply said, "I like the quiet." That answer became part of his identity. Some fans admired it deeply, seeing him as humble and real. Others found it unusual, expecting a Hollywood star to love attention. But Keanu never changed his ways. His silence also helped him in his craft. When he prepared for a role, he didn't distract himself with endless conversations or crowded places. He would retreat into quiet spaces, study his lines, and reflect on the character's emotions. The stillness gave him depth. Directors noticed how deeply he connected with his roles, and they realized that his quiet nature was not a weakness, it was a strength. It allowed him to focus, to feel, and to bring truth to the screen. Still, the misunderstanding never completely went away. In a world where being visible often meant being successful, his silence was sometimes seen as resistance. There were times when he lost out on projects simply because he wasn't part of the social circles that decided who was in and who was out. It cost him connections, and it cost him recognition. But every time he thought about what he gained instead, peace, balance, and honesty, he felt no regret. Friends who stayed close to him understood eventually. They realized that when Keanu gave his time, it meant something real. He wasn't the kind of person to talk endlessly or to fill silence with empty words. When he spoke, it mattered. When he listened, he really listened. His silence gave weight to his presence, making people trust him in ways that noise never could. As Keanu's career grew, so did the respect for his choices. While he might not have been the most seen actor at glamorous parties, he was seen as one of the most grounded. His silence became part of his legend. People began to admire the way he chose peace over pressure, calm over chaos. They saw in him a rare example of someone who stayed true to himself in a world that constantly pushed for the opposite. But the road was not always smooth. There were nights when he sat alone and wondered if he had made life harder by choosing silence. There were moments when the loneliness crept in, whispering doubts. Yet even in those moments, he held on to his belief. He knew that the quiet path was not the easiest, but it was the most honest. And in Hollywood, honesty was rare. For Keanu Reeves, choosing silence over parties was more than a preference, it was a way of survival. It protected him from losing himself to a world that often swallowed people whole. It gave him a strength that could not be bought, and a clarity that could not be faked. And even though it cost him some chances, it gave him something far more valuable, a life that was real. In Hollywood, silence is rarely seen as strength. For many, it is taken as distance, as if a quiet person has nothing to offer. This was the cost Keanu Reeves began to face. The more he chose solitude over loud gatherings, the more people whispered. They called him mysterious, but not always in a kind way. Some thought he was unfriendly, others believed he was hiding something. In an industry built on visibility, being absent often meant being forgotten. Keanu understood this, yet he did not change. When others rushed from one celebration to another, he was often at home with his books or music. When others fought for attention in crowded rooms, he slipped quietly out of the back door. The truth was that he valued his peace more than he valued applause in social spaces. But as time passed, he began to see the price of this choice. There were projects where the producers assumed he was not interested because they rarely saw him mingling. There were directors who chose actors they had spent time with at parties, simply because those friendships felt stronger. Even though Keanu's skill and dedication were undeniable, the absence of social presence sometimes worked against him. His silence, which brought him clarity, also made him invisible in moments where visibility mattered most. Yet even when he missed out on opportunities, he reminded himself that losing a role was not the same as losing himself. He knew actors who chased every party and every chance to impress, and he watched how quickly they burned out. Some lost themselves in addictions, some lost their families, and others simply lost the sense of who they were. Keanu did not want that for his life. He wanted something deeper than the spotlight. But still, the cost could sting. He remembered times when he sat at home after turning down an invitation, and a small voice inside asked, "What if you are losing too much?" Loneliness was real. Choosing silence meant fewer connections, fewer friendships, and sometimes fewer people to lean on. At events where he did appear, he sometimes felt the gap. Everyone else seemed closer, laughing over shared memories from nights he had not attended. He smiled politely, but he could feel the distance. The press did not help. Reporters noticed his quiet nature and began painting him as a loner. Magazines speculated about why he avoided the party life. Some said he was shy, others said he was broken, and a few even suggested he was arrogant. None of them truly understood. For Keanu, silence was not about being cold or unfriendly. It was about protecting his spirit. But in a world that judged what it saw, silence left too much room for misunderstanding. One of the clearest examples of the cost came during the early 2000s. Hollywood was full of loud stars making headlines, and studios often favored actors who were constantly visible. Keanu, who preferred quiet nights, was sometimes seen as out of touch. He was not the one laughing in the photos, shaking hands in crowded halls, or charming executives over late-night drinks. He was the one who left quietly, disappearing into the night while cameras turned elsewhere. The cost was roles that slipped through his fingers simply because someone else was more present in those rooms. Yet even with these losses, Keanu held on to his values. He reminded himself of the times when noise made him feel small and restless. He remembered how much calmer he felt after a night spent reading or riding through the city in silence. He knew that if he forced himself into the lifestyle others wanted, he would be betraying his true self. That was a price he was never willing to pay. The cost was also emotional. People sometimes assumed he was unfriendly when he was simply quiet. They confused silence with disinterest. They did not see that he cared deeply, listened carefully, and respected people more than most. But because he was not the loudest in the room, some overlooked his kindness. This misunderstanding followed him often, and he accepted it with patience. He did not try to explain himself to everyone. Instead, he let time reveal who he was. Despite all this, there were small victories hidden in his silence. The people who stayed close to him knew the truth. They knew that his calm nature made him trustworthy. They knew that when Keanu was with someone, he was fully present, not distracted by noise or empty words. His silence gave his relationships depth. He might not have had the largest circle of friends, but the ones he had were genuine. And though Hollywood sometimes shut its doors on him, fans opened their hearts wider. They saw in him something different from other stars. They saw a man who valued meaning over noise, truth over popularity. One evening, after walking away from yet another party early, Keanu found himself reflecting on what he had given up. He thought about the roles he might have lost, the friendships that never formed, and the distance others sometimes kept from him. For a moment, doubt touched his heart. But then he remembered the peace he felt whenever he chose silence. He thought of the nights spent riding under the stars, the mornings spent reading quietly, and the balance that kept him steady through the storms of life. That peace was priceless. Compared to that, the cost of missed opportunities felt small. His story began to teach others too. Younger actors noticed that even without chasing every party, Keanu still built a career full of respect. They saw that it was possible to step back from the noise and still shine. Fans admired his mystery, not as a weakness but as a kind of strength. Over time, the very thing that seemed to cost him his silence became the thing that defined him. Keanu Reeves accepted the cost of silence because he knew the reward was greater. The reward was not fame or applause, but something deeper, a sense of self that could not be shaken by rumors, rejections, or loneliness. The cost was real, yes, but so was the gift. And as he continued walking his quiet path, he showed the world that sometimes the price of being true is worth paying. With time, what once seemed like a weakness began to reveal itself as a hidden strength. Keanu Reeves, the man often called quiet, distant, or mysterious, slowly became an example of calmness in a world that never stopped shouting. While others fought to be the loudest voice in the room, his silence made people lean in closer. The power of his choice began to show itself not only in his life but also in the way people viewed him. In Hollywood, trends come and go. Styles change, stars rise and fall, but what lasts is authenticity. Keanu's silence gave him that authenticity. When he walked into a room, he didn't have to speak loudly to be noticed. His presence carried weight because people knew he wasn't there to pretend. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't trying to be someone else. He was simply himself, and that truth had a strength that no spotlight could fake. Fans began to see the side of him too. They noticed how he handled interviews. While many actors filled every second with endless talk, Keanu often paused before answering. His words were measured, soft, and thoughtful. He didn't speak to entertain, he spoke to be honest. This quiet style became his signature. It set him apart from others, and it built a reputation for humility. People admired that he was not chasing attention but instead giving respect through stillness. On movie sets, his silence was also a gift. Directors spoke about how focused he was, how carefully he listened, and how deeply he connected to his characters. While others might spend their breaks on distractions, Keanu often stayed quietly in thought, preparing himself for the next scene. The calm he carried within gave him patience, which allowed him to give his best even under pressure. His silence turned into discipline, and his discipline turned into art. Outside of work, the power of silence showed itself in even greater ways. Life had not always been kind to Keanu. He had faced grief, loss, and loneliness that could break anyone's spirit. Many people would have drowned their pain in endless distractions, using noise to avoid their feelings. But Keanu faced his pain in silence. He let the stillness carry him through sorrow, and in that stillness, he found strength. Instead of hiding from grief, he allowed himself to feel it. Instead of pretending to be happy, he allowed silence to heal him slowly. This resilience made him stronger than the chaos around him. In interviews, when asked about why he lived so quietly, he never gave long explanations. He would smile slightly and say things like, "I enjoy the simple things." These simple words carried power. They reminded people that peace didn't come from the size of your house, the number of parties you attended, or the noise of constant fame. Peace came from the ability to sit alone and still feel whole. This message resonated deeply with fans around the world. Many began to see silence not as emptiness but as wisdom. Keanu also began to influence the way people thought about life in Hollywood. In a place where actors were often measured by how much attention they demanded, his calm nature reminded others that respect could be earned in quieter ways. His silence showed that kindness and humility could be just as powerful as charm and showmanship. Instead of being remembered for the loudest speech, he was remembered for the gentlest presence. His reputation grew beyond his movies. Fans shared stories about him sitting on a park bench, lost in thought, or offering his seat to strangers on the subway. They admired that despite his fame, he chose a life of simplicity. His silence was not about distance, it was about balance. It allowed him to stay connected to the real world, to people, and to himself. The power of his choice also became clear in how he handled fame itself. Many stars struggled with the pressure of being watched all the time. They often broke under the weight of constant attention. But Keanu, by valuing silence, created a space where fame could not control him. He didn't need to be seen at every party or in every headline. He was content to step back, knowing his work would speak for him. This gave him a rare freedom that others envied. One striking example of this power happened during a major film press event. While other actors entertained the crowd with big stories and jokes, Keanu sat calmly, listening and occasionally smiling. When it was his turn to speak, he didn't try to outshine anyone. Instead, he gave a short, thoughtful answer about how grateful he was for the opportunity. The room grew quiet as he spoke, not because his voice was loud, but because it was genuine. People listened more closely to him than to those who tried too hard to impress. His silence gave weight to his words, and his words gave him respect. Even his co-stars began to notice how his quietness brought balance. Many said that working with Keanu felt peaceful. His calm presence reduced stress on set. He never demanded special treatment or created drama. Instead, he carried himself with humility and kindness. His silence made others feel comfortable, knowing they didn't need to pretend around him. This built trust and loyalty that lasted long after the cameras stopped rolling. Though silence had cost him earlier in his career, by now it had shaped his legacy. People saw him not as the actor who missed parties but as the man who stayed real. The very thing that once made him seem different was now the thing that made him special. His stillness, his thoughtfulness, and his quiet strength became part of his legend. For Keanu, the power of silence was never about escaping life but about embracing it more fully. It gave him space to feel joy deeply, to process pain honestly, and to see the world clearly. In a noisy industry, his silence became his shield, protecting him from distractions and false promises. It became his compass, guiding him toward what truly mattered. Over time, fans and fellow actors alike began to see silence differently because of him. They realized that it was not about being weak or disconnected, it was about having the courage to stand apart. And Keanu's life proved that silence could hold more strength than the loudest voice in the room. As the years passed, Keanu Reeves' life became a living example of what it meant to stay true to oneself. The boy who once felt out of place at loud Hollywood parties had grown into a man admired across the world for his quiet strength. His story was not only about movies, fame, or success, it was about the choices he made and the peace he found in silence. What once seemed like an unusual habit had turned into a philosophy of life, one that inspired millions of people who saw in him something they longed for: authenticity. Keanu often reflected on the path he had chosen. He knew it had not been easy. Silence had cost him opportunities, friendships, and moments where others advanced faster because they mingled more. But when he looked back, he saw that he had gained something far more precious. He had gained peace of mind, clarity of thought, and the ability to live without pretending. In an industry where many lost themselves trying to be what others wanted, he found himself by simply being quiet. There were still times when people misunderstood him. Some continued to see him as a loner or someone unwilling to socialize. But Keanu did not live to correct those opinions. He believed that truth showed itself with time, and he did not need to shout to prove who he was. Those who truly knew him understood that his silence was not a wall but a window. It allowed him to listen more, to care more deeply, and to live more honestly. The legacy of his choice could be seen in the way fans spoke about him. Stories spread not about wild nights or dramatic scandals but about small, simple acts of kindness. People shared how he gave up his seat on a subway, how he donated quietly to hospitals and schools, how he stopped to talk to strangers without rushing away. These stories mattered more than any party appearance. They revealed that silence gave him space to notice the world around him. Because he was not drowning in noise, he could see the small details of life, and in those details, he found ways to give back. Keanu also realized that silence had given him longevity in his career. Many actors who had once been louder than him had faded, their fame tied only to attention that could not last. But Keanu remained, not because he chased every headline, but because he let his work and his character speak for him. His movies continued to succeed, not only because of his talent but because audiences trusted him as a person. They believed in his honesty, and that honesty carried into the roles he played. The world began to appreciate the beauty of quietness through his example. Fans started to say that Keanu represented a kind of peace missing in modern life. They admired that he was not afraid of being alone, that he could walk through a busy street and still carry himself with calm dignity. For many, his story was proof that silence could be a source of strength, even in a world built on noise. There was one evening, much later in his life, when Keanu sat by himself on a balcony overlooking the city. Lights flickered across the skyline, cars moved like streams of light below, and far away he could hear the faint hum of traffic. It was a familiar scene, noise surrounding silence. As he sipped his tea, he thought about the journey he had walked. He remembered the first parties where he felt out of place, the misunderstandings, the roles he had lost, the friendships that never grew. He also remembered the long motorcycle rides under the stars, the books that kept him company, and the moments of stillness that gave him strength to face hardships. In that reflection, he felt no regret. He knew he had paid a price, but he also knew the value of what he gained. His life became a message to others who felt pressured by the noise of the world. He showed them that it was possible to choose differently, to step away from the expectations of constant attention, and still live a meaningful life. He reminded people that it was not necessary to be everywhere or to be seen all the time. Sometimes the most powerful thing one could do was to be quiet, to listen, and to stay true. Younger generations of actors often came to him for advice. They wanted to know how to survive the pressures of fame, how to balance work with personal peace. Keanu always spoke softly, with humility, reminding them that success without peace was not real success. He told them that the world would always push them to chase attention, but the real strength was knowing when to step back. Many left those conversations feeling lighter, inspired not by big speeches but by the quiet wisdom of a man who had lived his truth. In the end, what silence cost him seemed small compared to what it gave him. He lost some roles, some connections, and some moments of social acceptance. But he gained resilience, self-respect, and a legacy that could not be shaken. He became an icon not just for his films but for his way of living. His silence told a story louder than any party could, a story of choosing peace over pressure, depth over noise, and truth over pretense. Keanu Reeves' journey is remembered today not only in Hollywood but in the hearts of people everywhere who struggle with the pressure of being seen, being loud, or being enough in the eyes of others. His life whispers a reminder: it is okay to choose silence. It is okay to prefer stillness over crowds. It is okay to lose opportunities if it means keeping your peace. Because at the end of the day, what matters is not how much noise you make, but how true you remain to yourself. And so, his legacy continues not just in movies that will live on but in the quiet message of his life. A message that says you do not have to shout to be heard. You do not have to be at every party to be remembered. Sometimes, the greatest strength lies in silence, and sometimes, the greatest victory is simply being at peace.